Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Durán, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
The billionaires, or better said, the oligarchs, as it is implied in the term, exert disproportional influence and control over the world's political power. Media outlets, military discourse, human labor, natural and urban resources, including those that we commonly regard as public. In this episode, I ask, is there anything public left in our urban and territorial infrastructure? What is the meaning of public in oligarchy? On April 26th, the morning newsletter of the New York Times was titled A Billionaire's World. This was in reaction to Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. The article starts by quoting the famed pro-capitalist economist Emmanuel Saez and his partner Gabriel Zucman, who published research on extreme American economic inequality that looks at the share of wealth owned by the wealthiest, get this, 0.0001% of Americans, who are represented by only 18 households. I repeat again, 18 households. Each of them with an average net worth of about 66 billion. These were numbers of 2020, and I am certain that that number has increased. But in that research, these economists show that the share of national wealth owned by these 18 families had already risen by a factor of nearly 10 or tenfold since the dawn of neoliberalism around 1982. De facto breaking the 1920s record of extreme inequality in the US. So yes, the United States of America has never been this unequal. And what for me makes it more alarming is that this statistic is mimicked in most countries around the world. A disturbing fact that demonstrates that oligarchy has replaced democracy as the power structure of our times. According to Forbes magazine, 2,668 billionaires roamed the planet as it is of today. That is 573 more billionaires than at the start of the pandemic. To put it in perspective, this number of billionaires corresponds to the 0.0003% of the global population, which is currently estimated at 7.9 billion humans. Out of the 2,668 oligarchs, close to 1/3 of them lived in America. 735 billionaires to be precise. Together, they amass more than 4.7 trillion worth of wealth. Sorry to repeat numbers again, but I said $4.7 trillion. In contrast, Russia has 83 billionaires, or approximately 1/10 of what the US has. But according to most Western media outlets, the Russian billionaires are the bad boys, right? Their vilification obviously comes from their close relationship with Putin. Still, it also comes from an understanding that they are billionaires because they have stolen the resources that used to belong to the Russian public, such as natural resources and its extractivist industries, like natural gas, oil, mining, logging, but also from other public infrastructures, such as telecommunications, subsistence utilities, roads, bridges, waterways, parks, housing, and even the military. Of course, there are distinct differences in how these 83 Russian billionaires acquired their wealth vis-a-vis their 735 American billionaire counterparts. Still, if we look closer, there are also many similarities. Mainly, if we focus on the transfer/selling of public infrastructure over the last 40 years through what is known as the neoliberal turn in Western democracies, for which I talk a lot about. And this view does not only come from declared anti-capitalists such as myself. This view has been a prevailing sort of concept amongst mainstream economists too. Just recently, in an op-ed in the British newspaper The Guardian, the uber-famous pro-capitalist economist Thomas Piketty, it is a writing research partner of Emmanuel Saez, which is an author I just referred to on extreme American income inequality. Piketty wrote the following, and I quote him: "In Europe and the United States, everything is done to distinguish useful and deserving Western entrepreneurs from harmful and parasitic Russian, Chinese, Indian, or African oligarchs. But the truth is that they have much in common. In particular, the immense prosperity of multimillionaires on all continents since the 1980s and 90s can be explained largely by the same factors, particularly by the favors and privileges granted to them." And again, this was Thomas Piketty quoting this. The favors and privileges granted by these billionaires, which Piketty talks about, are undoubtedly similar regardless of country, perhaps except for China. But let me explain what I mean by this with a few urban examples of what the ownership and control of public resources have meant to the general population, aka not billionaires. First, let me touch upon one of the most championed components of contemporary urban agglomerations: public space. You would be hard-pressed to find an urban planner, an architect, designer, or artist that does not defend it tooth and nail. Politicians love to include public space in their discourse, and academics rejoice in writing about its abstract potential to democratize. Nevertheless, its concrete existence is far from idealized or romantic abstractions. In the concrete, public space is defined by legislation. According to lawinsiders.com's top definition, public space means, and I quote, "any real property or structures on real property owned by a government entity and normally accessible to the public, including but not limited to parks and other residential areas." End of quote. The key term here is that public space is, in theory, owned by a government entity, which also, in theory, is elected democratically and also, in theory, governs for the good of the public realm. As I have explained in previous podcasts, the neoliberal turn incentivized city governments to privatize public space design, development, and management to private stakeholders, developers, businesses, and individuals. 40 years of strong incentives to develop private-public initiatives have left cities with a public space landscape heavily defined by the desires of those in command of the money-power elites, or better said, an oligarchy. Take Jeff Bezos and their privileged havoc it exposed in 2018 when he announced the building of Amazon's headquarters 2, or as it's more referred recently as HQ2. This prompted cities across the US to compete for his liking. In this competition, the city of Atlanta offered more than $2 billion in taxpayer-funded incentives. It also offered to fund the Amazon Georgia Academy, which will be part of a public state university-affiliated education program, which consisted of a 24-week boot camp that was there to serve company employees. Atlanta also offered the building of an exclusive lounge with free parking for Amazon executives at the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, which, by the way, is one of the busiest airports in the world. And it also offered to rename a public street into, get this, Alexa Way. And these together with other public spaces. Chicago also offered $2.25 billion in tax incentives and a $400 million incentive in infrastructure spending, including new public roads, new public sewers, and manicured public space areas around Amazon's new development. Montgomery County in Maryland offered Amazon the largest economic development package in the state's history, totaling $6.5 billion in tax incentives, plus $2 billion in public infrastructure and public transportation improvements for the area surrounding the possible development of Amazon's headquarters 2. New York City also was there, and first won the bid, but then was canceled. But it had offered Bezos a close to $3 billion incentive package that included the offering of the public land in their projected 4 million square feet development, and give it a special designation to bypass all public land use review processes, as well to override all public and zoning regulations. New York City was also proposing the development of another Metropolitan Transit Authority public railway station to service better Amazon employees. On the surface, the HQ2 spectacle reveals once more that today, urbanization at the command of publicly elected officials has turned into an act of siphoning public wealth to aid the greater enrichment of oligarchs. Urbanization and all that is deemed public have been at the service of the ultra-rich's wants, needs, and desires for decades. As a result, there are countless urbanization projects worldwide where public space has been subjugated to private management. In fact, too many that the soft privatization of public spaces has been normalized in municipal laws and popular culture. It is expected that the new public spaces have some kind of private oversight. Public parks have conservancies. Public plazas have sponsors and partnerships. Public streets have business improvement districts, etc. And despite this private oversight being notorious for rendering highly unequal urban areas and regions, it continues to be the preferred form of development. The New York City Central Park Conservancy has very wealthy donors, and thus the park has far more public-private resources than, say, Sunset Park in Brooklyn. The public plazas in Baltimore's Inner Harbor are kept pristine by the sponsorship of Johns Hopkins and other private corporations. In contrast, most of its public plazas are kept in a derelict state. The streets of the Downtown Business Improvement District in Detroit are kept relatively safe, while the immediate streets outside are suffering high criminality rates. And I can go on and on with examples in the US, Latin America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Asia. But if we look deeper into Jeff Bezos' HQ2, it incorporates a private command over public space and resources that reflects the new oligarch period within neoliberalism. And what I find more distressing is that it is becoming a trend. Unlike the classic neoliberal urban developments of the past 4 decades, Bezos' project made some states and cities offer the biggest economic incentives in their history. New York State Governor Cuomo at that time proudly said in a press conference the following, and I quote him, "This is the largest economic development initiative that has ever been done by the city or the state, or the city and the state together." He said that happily. The whole, take this, the whole of New York State and New York City, America's richest and largest city, were put at one oligarch's service. One. Bezos' HQ2 is certainly not the only example of the power of oligarchy over seemingly democratic urban regions. In North America, I could talk about Elon Musk's play over Austin, the city headquarters of Tesla, or Larry Page's desire to rebuild Toronto's waterfront into a smart city district, which was to be developed by Google, or the new Bill Gates venture of developing a smart city outside Phoenix in Arizona, or Carlos Slim's command over the area of Santa Fe in Mexico City, or even Mark Lohr's $500 billion apolitical utopian city called Telosa, which doesn't have a territory yet. These city-scale interventions have many things in common with Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum's rule over Dubai, or Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani rules over Qatar, or Putin oligarchs rule over Moscow City in Moscow. But the one thing that stands out the most in all these developments is the oligarchs' desire to materialize their visions at the expense of any existing public at a never-seen scale. To the oligarchs, the meaning of public is reversed, as all things public are there to be taken and transformed by their private privilege, for a profit, of course. And as we have seen, the more wealth they accumulate, the more significant the scale of their ambitions to take on the public. Take, for example, Elon Musk's takeover attempts on the public road and highway infrastructure of the United States and Europe by building an exclusive network of Tesla charging stations across their territories. As the Biden administration prepares to spend billions of dollars developing a national public network of electric vehicle charging stations, Elon Musk plans to piggyback on this public stimulus. To get his hands on this public utility, he offered the US government to partially open their Tesla supercharging stations to other cars, other manufacturers, but of course with some limitations. Tesla wants federal money for each station it creates, but in exchange, it wants some of that money to be used for the exclusive benefit of Tesla. Elon Musk's company currently runs over 13,000 stalls in the United States. 58% of all the available fast charging stations. If the lobbying goes his way, he will soon have absolute monopoly power over a national public utility grid of the world's wealthiest nation. Amongst many dangers posed by the oligarch class, I want to stress that urbanization under their control is at the top 5 on my list. Capitalism, together with all its legal apparatus and democratic allure, supports 100% the authoritarianism of oligarchs. This is why fascism is so attractive to them. It is, after all, the ultimate consequence of its regime. The monopoly power over urbanization, over large territories, is a dictatorial right given to oligarchs by capitalism to enjoy profitable play over the rights of others, to steer the public to whatever direction he pleases, to speculate over the complete life of the planet, humans and other species, and to be revered as the one visionary. This might actually be for them the closest thing to being a god, to imprint their vision in the daily life of ordinary people permanently. Let me remind you that 50 years ago, when neoliberalism was not dominant and billionaires did not exist, democratic governments and communist states too had grand visions for developing public goods and wealth. Even non-rich states were planning to spend public resources on genuinely public urban infrastructure, public parks, public schools, public health facilities, public museums, public concert venues, public transportation, public roads, public utilities, public telecommunications, etc. The debate at that time was about which political ideology would produce the most welfare for humanity, whether it was capitalism, communism, socialism, fascism, etc. Today, as capitalism reigns as the supreme ideology, there is hardly any debate over public welfare. It seems that it's all about which oligarch will benefit us the most, selecting the good guy amongst them. Now, the questions in territorial and urban planning are about which oligarch or billion-dollar corporation to give public resources in the name of private contracts or concessions. And we all hope then that they make proper use of public money by giving something back in exchange for the ridiculous personal profit and monopoly command. I constantly ask myself, is it possible to foresee a future political scenario that reverts that trend? I do think so. History is on our side with this. It is important to emphasize that many of the assets of the Gilded Age ultra-rich families also ended gradually with the federal public taking over their monopolies. At one point, Cornelius Vanderbilt accumulated a greater fortune than what the US Treasury had at that time. His son, Billy Vanderbilt, managed to double that fortune, having an almost absolute monopoly over all train tracks in the United States. Through 2 other generations of Vanderbilts, a lot of mismanagement, and the slow but solid federal emphasis on public transportation projects, all of their stake in railroads was taken over in 1971 by the publicly owned Amtrak company. It took many decades, with 2 world wars in between and numerous economic crises, but it was possible. Today, things are vastly different from the times of the Gilded Age, but they are also similar in many ways. A large percentage of the wealth in the US is concentrated in 728 billionaires, 0.0003% of the total population. Extreme inequality is rampant and economic crisis abounds. monopoly control over public spaces, public infrastructure, and public discourse is rising. And back then, at the time of the Gilded Age, all of these were similar symptoms of capitalist accumulation as it collided suddenly with the modernist visions of what we now refer to as a welfare state, of ideas of a nation sharing wealth, of giving more importance to the public's well-being. These visions of anti-oligarchs gave way to 3 decades of urbanization, the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, which were mainly based on providing welfare. Despite its many contradictions, these times rendered the most equal period in the history of Western democracies. It was a period where the redistribution of wealth was actually happening. Imagine that. If it wasn't for the coercion of neoliberals, the world might still be grappling with the contradictions of new forms of welfare capitalism. But here we are. It certainly won't be easy, but it is definitely possible. But we first need an overdose of optimism and, most of all, radical imagination. In each of our occupations, we must actively participate in the production of new imaginaries, engaging more in politics, and of course, more in the streets. In my view, there is no other way out. We must force ourselves to collectively imagine and act upon new imaginaries as others have done before us.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.